Hello everybody and welcome to the second episode in the AorbTech NumPy series. Today we're going to be talking about arrays, including one-dimensional arrays and two-dimensional arrays. So let's get started. In this episode we're going to be learning what arrays are, how to create your first one-dimensional array and your first second-dimensional array, all using NumPy. So what are arrays? Well, arrays first and foremost are data structures. That means that they are a method of storing data or information within a computer. Arrays are static, meaning that they take up a certain amount of space in memory in the computer and they don't change size throughout the runtime of the program. That means that once you create an array, it will have that number of elements for the rest of the runtime of the program. Arrays are also mutable. This means that you can change the values of the data inside of the arrays during the runtime of the program. And finally, arrays are ordered. This means that each element in the array has its own index that you can use to access that element in the array. Arrays differ from lists in the way that they take up less memory in your RAM, in your storage, and they are faster to look up. That means that when you search for an element in an array, it's going to take far shorter of a time to search for it than it would in a list, other than the differences mentioned prior. So let's get into creating your first array using NumPy. First of all, we have to import NumPy, so we can do that by simply importing NumPy as such. And now we can use NumPy in our code. Let's go to this first section here. How do we create an array using NumPy? Well, first we have to define a variable here. And we're going to say that we're going to use NumPy here. And we're going to use the array function. And the array function is going to allow us to make an array. Let's say we put some random numbers in here. It doesn't matter really what we put in here. It could be anything. And as soon as we do that, let's see what is inside of this array, what it's going to look like when we print it. As you can see, all of the elements that we put inside when we define the array can be accessed and seen as a string as such. Now let's say we want to see what kind of data type this is. Well, if we use the type function on our array variable, it returns that it is a NumPy ND array. ND array, what this is basically, this means that it's an n-dimensional array. This can be 1, 2, 3, or any dimension basically. And we'll see what that means a little bit later. And this tells us also that it comes from NumPy. So this specific data type is one defined by NumPy, and it's one that we can use to create all these different types of arrays. Now, let's see the dimensionality of this array. Now, what is a dimensionality? Well, dimensionality essentially is, as we were talking before about n-dimensional arrays, one-dimensional, two-dimensional arrays, essentially it's the number of indentations you have in the arrays. Think about it kind of like a 1D plane, a 2D plane, and a 3D plane. The number of axes that you have is an interesting way to look at this. You can see them kind of like a matrix or like a three-dimensional matrix, for example. And in that way, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of visualize how an array looks like. So we can access the dimensionality of an array by using NDIM. And this will tell us the dimensionality of the array. And as you can see, because we created a 1D array, it simply returns 1. Now, let's see how we can get the size of this array. So, what we do here is we array and size. We print that, and we get 5. What this tells us is the number of elements inside of the array. As you can see here, we have 5 different elements: 10, 122, 76, 28, and 4. Another thing we can do is we can check the array's data type using NumPy. And we can do this by using dtype after array. What this tells us is basically the data type that's being stored inside of the array. Arrays can only have one data type that they store inside, as opposed to other data structures which might allow you to have multiple data types like strings, integers, characters, booleans, etc. Well, arrays can only have one of those. So how to create two-dimensional arrays, and for that matter, what even is a two-dimensional array? A two-dimensional array basically is, in the easiest form to think about it, an array within an array and you can kind of expand that so you have an array within an array within an array within an array, and that'll be a 4-dimensional array, for example. But for this episode, we're just going to focus on up to 2 dimensions. And creating it is pretty simple. It's very similar to creating a 1D array. What we do is we create an array. Let's call it array underscore 2D. And we're going to say it's equal to, then we're going to use NumPy. And we're going to use the array function. And within this array function, we're going to create a pair of brackets. And inside that, we're going to create another pair of brackets. So this is kind of an array. And inside that array, there's another array. And we're going to use a comma to create the second part, which is here. And this is the kind of array within an array, and then the second array within that array. So there's an array that can have multiple arrays inside it. And I can't think of another situation where I'd have to say the word array so many times. So inside these arrays, we can put our own little values like 12, 13, 14, for example. Here we can have some more values, 15, 16, 17. And it's important to note you cannot place values inside here. You can't put like 12, you can just put other arrays. So if we just print this, we'll see what it looks like kind of. And what you can do is you can add even more of them. So let's say we want to carry it on 18, 19, 20. And now you have a sort of 3x3 kind of area. That's another interesting way of looking at it. You can look at it kind of like as a grid of elements, right? So this would be on the first row. This would be the second row, and this would be kind of the third row. And each of these is like a third of each column, depending on how many different arrays you have inside of this one. You can even add a fourth one. But an important thing to note is that you can only have the same number of elements inside of each of them. You can't create one with like a single element, for example. Let's just add 10 here, and you'll see we get an error. So that wouldn't work. Now let's say we want to see the shape of this one, so I'll go to, and this is where the shape property becomes useful. As you can see, what this basically shows us is, like I was saying before, you can describe this as a kind of 3x3 grid, right? And that's literally what this is telling us here. It's saying 3x3, right? Which is really cool. So if you had something like a 2x3, let's say we remove one of these here, run that, and now let's see the shape, and you can see it's a 2x3 grid, which is really, really, really cool. Let's check the data type. Maybe it's changed. Maybe it's, as you can remember, the first one was an ND array. So if we check it using the type function, did it change types? No, it's still an ND array. And basically you can substitute any number in there. So long as it's non-negative, you can't have a negatively sized array. This would be like a 2D array basically. So now let's see what kind of data type is inside here. As you can see, we have integer 64. That's the kind of data type that's inside of this array. So in here you can see we have 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Those are all integers. And this is the same as the previous data type, which if we go up to this array here, as you can see, it has all of these numbers here. These are all numbers basically. And now if we want to check the dimensionality, so as we said, this is a 2D array. So if we go here and we put NDIM, that's the n dimensionality, we'll see it gives us a 2. So we confirm that it's a 2D array. And that's basically all you really need to know about the basics of creating 1D and 2D arrays and arrays in general. So that was a pretty short episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe, like, and share, and hit that bell icon if you want to see more videos like this explaining interesting topics having to do with programming and data science. We have a whole series on NumPy if you want to check that out on our YouTube channel. We also have a GitHub with the source code from this entire notebook that I've made here. We also have a website if you want to check that out. And if you have no idea what you're doing here and you've just kind of stumbled upon this and you want to learn more and you're intrigued, then check out our programming course. We have a Python course if you want to check that out, and we have so many other courses if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.